Sometimes a whisper from the past doesn't fade. It lingers in the folds of memory, waiting for the right silence to be heard. Tonight's story is about steps once danced in secret and a final performance no one expected. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The morning light slanted through the lace curtains of Jessica Fletcher's kitchen in Cabot Cove, casting soft shadows on the checkered tablecloth. A small pot of tea steamed gently beside her favorite mug, half filled and cooling. Her gaze, however, was fixed not on the tea, but on the cream-colored envelope resting beside it. No return address, just her name in a slanted, elegant hand she hadn't seen in years. She picked it up carefully, noting the Provincetown postmark. The weight of the paper was thick, deliberate, the kind used for invitations or regrets. Inside a single sheet, "You are cordially invited to a private recital one night only by the sea. For Eleanor." No date, no time, only a handwritten line beneath. "You'll know where to find it." Jessica reread the note, a curious tension rising in her chest. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar, though she couldn't yet place it. There was something faintly theatrical about the whole affair, and something hauntingly personal. She held the envelope to the light, as if hoping some hidden message might reveal itself. Instead, all she saw was her own breath, fogging the paper, and the first tremor of memory surfacing. She brought the envelope closer, letting her fingers trace the ink, dark blue, not black, and flowing in a hand that once danced rather than wrote. A hint of perfume lingered in the fibers of the paper, faint but undeniably floral, not the cloying kind of department store fragrance, but something rarer, older, hyacinth and lavender perhaps. The scent triggered something, but not quite a memory, more a feeling. Jessica rose and walked to her study, where she kept a small collection of correspondence from years past, invitations, thank you notes, a few programs from charity events and benefit recitals. She flipped through them until she found what she was looking for, a letter from the Provincetown Arts Festival dated nearly 25 years ago. The handwriting was different, younger then, but the flourishes, the way the T's looped low and the Y's curled back like a dancer's ankle, were almost identical. She returned to the envelope, now resting on the arm of her chair. It wasn't just the words or the scent that stirred her, it was the silence wrapped around them. The kind of silence that held a question you didn't realize you'd been waiting to ask. Jessica stood by the window, watching the leaves shift restlessly in the coastal breeze. Provincetown. It had been years since she'd even thought of it, let alone considered returning. A place where artists once congregated like migrating birds, painters, poets, musicians, dancers, and among them, briefly, one woman who stood apart. A woman Jessica had met only once, perhaps twice, at a gallery opening and later, a modest rehearsal in a sunlit room near the pier. She couldn't remember her full name, something with grace in it, maybe veil or vellum, but she remembered the way she moved, not like a ballerina performing for applause, but like someone remembering something painful and trying to forgive it with every gesture. A solo dancer in a town built for ensembles. Jessica had written her into a short story once, thinly veiled, a woman whose secrets were measured in silence rather than scandal. And now this envelope, this scent, this invitation. The past, she thought, doesn't always knock. Sometimes it dances back into the room without a sound. That afternoon, Jessica walked down to the dockside cafe where Seth Hazlitt sat, newspaper folded on his lap and coffee cooling beside him. When she handed him the envelope, he read the note in silence, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well," he said finally, "if this isn't the start of one of your mysteries, I don't know what is." Jessica smiled, though her mind was elsewhere. Do you remember Eleanor Vale, the dancer? Seth rubbed his chin. Didn't she disappear from the stage years ago? Went quiet all of a sudden. She did, Jessica said. And now this. Seth handed the note back to her. If someone doesn't want you poking around, they've got a funny way of saying so. Jessica nodded, her fingers curling slightly around the envelope. It's either an invitation or a warning. I'm not sure which. Seth looked at her carefully. You thinking of going? Jessica glanced out over the water, where the horizon blurred into mist. I think I have to. Back at home, Jessica moved through her study with quiet purpose. The envelope lay on her desk, beside a worn copy of Coastal Dancers of New England. She had already called the rail line, confirmed a morning departure, and packed a small overnight bag. She wasn't chasing danger, she told herself, only curiosity, and maybe, if she was honest, something more than that. A pull toward a part of her life she had quietly tucked away, like a scarf worn only once. At the bureau, she paused before selecting a pair of earrings, understated pearls Eleanor might have admired. She slipped them into her case, along with a notebook, a pen, and her most comfortable walking shoes. Her hand hovered over the last item, a program from the arts festival years ago. She tucked it in without further thought. As she latched the bag, she glanced again at the envelope. Its presence in her home already felt inevitable, like a story waiting to begin. And if it was a story, she would follow it, carefully, cautiously, to the next page. The train pulled out of Cabot Cove just after dawn, its gentle rhythm humming beneath Jessica's seat. She sat by the window, her notebook resting on her lap, though no words had yet found their way onto the page. Outside, the sky was layered in soft grays, the kind that held the promise of fog and the memory of sea. It was weather made for remembering and for forgetting, the kind of morning Eleanor would have danced into like a breath, long ago. Jessica watched the landscape shift from pine forest to wide salt marshes, her thoughts drifting to the studio by the pier, the soft click of point shoes on wood. She remembered the quiet in Eleanor's presence, and how people spoke of her not with admiration, but with reverence, and a touch of unease. In the seat beside her, the envelope remained tucked inside her purse. She hadn't read it again. She didn't need to. Sometimes, the body remembers what the mind resists. And as the train curved toward the coastline, Jessica Fletcher leaned slightly forward, not with fear or hesitation, but with the quiet resolve of someone who knows that the past never sends invitations lightly. The cab slowed along a narrow stretch of coastal road, where sea spray dusted the hedges and gulls cried overhead. Jessica Fletcher leaned forward, peering through the foggy glass at the house that had once belonged to the most enigmatic woman Provincetown had ever produced. The Vale residence stood just above the dunes, weathered shingles, shuttered windows, and a garden grown slightly wild, as though its keeper had forgotten time. She paid the driver and approached the ivy-trimmed gate. Before she could knock, the front door opened. A woman in a pale grey uniform stood in the doorway, slim and upright, her hands folded with quiet reserve. "You must be Mrs. Fletcher," she said. Not unfriendly, but not welcoming either. "Yes, I believe Miss Vale is expecting me." The woman gave a slow nod, her gaze assessing. "Come in, please. I'm Mrs. Dobbins. I see to the house." Inside, the air held the scent of old wood and something softer, lavender perhaps, or dusted rose. As Jessica stepped over the threshold, she had the distinct feeling of crossing into a world that had chosen to age behind closed doors, untouched by the present. Mrs. Dobbins led her through the house in silence, her steps measured, her glances careful. The corridor was lined with narrow tables bearing porcelain vases and faded programs from ballets long past. A hush seemed to follow them, so complete that Jessica could hear the low hum of wind against the eaves. They reached a set of French doors, half open to a sunroom awash in pale light. She paused at the threshold. Eleanor Vale sat in a high-backed cane chair near the window. Her posture was still proud, though her hair had gone entirely silver, and her frame had narrowed with time. She wore a soft cream shawl, and held a delicate teacup in both hands, as if to steady it or herself. "Jessica," Eleanor said, her voice cool but melodic, "it's been a very long time." Jessica stepped into the room, taking in the delicate piano in the corner, the stack of old scores, and the wide glass windows that looked out to the sea. The afternoon light made the room glow. "Yes," Jessica replied gently, "but perhaps not long enough for forgetting." Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite hers, and Jessica sat, her eyes tracing the fine lines in the older woman's face, like cracks in porcelain, beautiful and brittle. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eleanor said, setting her teacup down on the saucer with practiced elegance. "The invitation was unsigned," Jessica replied, "but something in it felt familiar." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. Familiarity is a dangerous thing. It can make us brave, or careless. A silence passed between them, heavy with what remained unspoken. Jessica decided to let it stretch a moment longer. "You left the stage quite suddenly," she said at last. "Some called it a disappearance." Eleanor turned slightly, her gaze following a gull gliding just beyond the glass. "Disappearance is such a romantic word. I prefer retreat." Jessica smiled faintly. "A retreat usually has a return." Eleanor did not respond immediately. Her fingers brushed the edge of a silk scarf, folded neatly in her lap. "I found the world quieter when no one applauded," she said, "and harder to betray when no one watched." The words were soft, but not bitter. Jessica listened closely, knowing that in Eleanor's world, even silence was choreographed. Jessica let the quiet settle again, allowing Eleanor's words to drift between them, like dust motes in the sun. Then gently she asked, "Did you send the invitation?" Eleanor reached for her cup, but her fingers stopped just short of the handle. She looked at Jessica with a strange stillness, the kind that precedes a change in tone or truth. "I don't recall," she said at last. Jessica tilted her head, watching her carefully. "It had your signature, not in ink, but in scent, in cadence." Eleanor smiled, a slow, practiced thing that never quite touched her eyes. "Perhaps someone wanted us to meet again," she said, returning her gaze to the sea. "Or someone wanted me to ask the wrong questions," Jessica replied softly. That smile wavered for just a second before Eleanor reached for her tea again. This time she lifted the cup without trembling. Jessica said nothing more. She knew better than to chase an answer when a subject chose a pirouette instead of a reply. Jessica's eyes wandered to the mantel behind Eleanor, where a neat row of black and white photographs stood. Each frame was thin and silver, polished with care. In one, Eleanor stood in mid-pose, arms arched above her head, her expression full of life and longing. Another showed a group of dancers, 3 women and 1 man, posed beneath a theatre marquee. Jessica stepped closer, drawn to the smallest figure in the back. A younger woman, perhaps no older than 20, stood slightly apart from the others, eyes fixed not on the camera, but on Eleanor. "Were these taken during the Provincetown season?" Jessica asked gently. Eleanor didn't turn. "Some in Boston, some here, some I no longer recall. And this one?" Jessica pointed. Eleanor glanced, then turned back to the window. "That's Clara, my sister. There was no affection in the name, just gravity. Jessica nodded, noting the tension in Eleanor's jaw. The room smelled of lavender and silence again, and Jessica sensed that each photo held more than a pose. They held grudges that had outlived applause. Eleanor sipped her tea, then set it down as if preparing for a performance. "You know, I once danced barefoot on that terrace," she said, nodding toward the sunlit tiles outside. "It was raining. The press called it a moment of liberation. In truth, I'd simply forgotten my slippers." Jessica chuckled. "They never let the truth get in the way of poetry." Eleanor's laugh followed, a soft exhale. "No, and dancers are the worst poets of all. We tell stories with our bodies, and assume no one will ask what they meant." Jessica leaned forward. "But someone always asks." Eleanor's gaze sharpened slightly, just for a breath. "Yes," she said, "and sometimes, someone listens too closely." Jessica saw the shift then, so small, most would miss it. The way Eleanor's hand tightened on the edge of her scarf, the way her smile lingered just a second too long. The past had returned to the room, not as a guest, but as a ghost with perfect posture. When Jessica rose to leave, Eleanor remained seated, her eyes once again drifting to the ocean beyond the glass. Mrs. Dobbins appeared as if summoned by silence, and led Jessica back through the narrow hallway. The hush of the house pressed closer now, like velvet draped over forgotten instruments. At the threshold, Jessica paused. "Thank you for receiving me." Eleanor gave the faintest nod. "It was curious, seeing you here again." Jessica hesitated, searching her face for something grounded. "If there's anything you'd like to share, Eleanor, I'm listening." But Eleanor only smiled, warm, wistful, and impenetrable. As Jessica stepped through the door, the afternoon had begun to turn, a fine mist gathering along the hedgerow. She glanced back only once. Eleanor hadn't moved from her chair. But just before the door closed, Jessica caught it, a flicker across the older woman's face. A flicker not of surprise or sadness, but something more elusive. Recognition, perhaps. Or fear. Jessica walked back toward the road, her thoughts quiet but alert. The house behind her had offered tea, memory, and hospitality, but not truth. Not yet. Jessica awoke just after dawn to the gentle tapping of fog against the window pane, that peculiar sound of sea mist brushing glass like fingertips from the past. The air in the room was cool, damp around the edges, the kind that settled in the corners of old buildings and old stories alike. She sat up slowly, reaching for her robe, though her sleep had been light and uneasy. Outside, Provincetown lay wrapped in silence. Even the gulls were subdued. Jessica drew the curtains open and watched the outlines of boats shift behind a veil of grey. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy chimed faintly, like a memory trying to rise. And yet, it wasn't the weather that unsettled her. It was a feeling, not fear, but disquiet. A sense that something was out of place. She couldn't name it, but it curled at the edge of her thoughts like unfinished music. She turned back toward the writing desk, meaning to note a few reflections from the day before, but her steps paused when she saw it. A folded piece of paper had been slipped beneath her door while she slept. Jessica stared at the folded note, its edges crisp against the worn rug. She bent to retrieve it, feeling the faintest tremor of anticipation in her fingers, the same sensation she often felt on the first page of a manuscript, before the mystery had yet revealed its shape. The paper was folded once, without an envelope. No signature, no decoration. She opened it carefully, the ink still dark and unblotted. "Leave now before the past stirs again." The handwriting was deliberate, even graceful, not rushed, not born of panic. That alone was more telling than the words themselves. Jessica stood still for a moment, the note resting against her palm. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a warning, or perhaps a plea. She looked to the door. The hallway beyond her room was quiet. She opened it slowly, peering down both ends. No sound, no footsteps, only the soft breathing of the old building and the salt air curling beneath it. Closing the door again, Jessica returned to the chair by the window and read the message once more. It wasn't what the note said that unsettled her. It was the calmness with which it had been left. Jessica brought the paper closer to the morning light, her eyes narrowing as she studied the details. The ink was a rich black blue, not ballpoint, but fountain, the kind that came from someone who wrote with intention. The paper, too, was telling. Not the coarse functional kind from a motel notepad, but smooth ivory vellum, thicker than expected, and faintly scented, hyacinth. She recognized it instantly. The same scent from the letter she'd received in Cabot Cove, not strong enough to be accidental, a signature of sorts, but the handwriting, it was more controlled than Eleanor's, too rigid, with a forward slant and narrow loops. A dancer wouldn't write like this, Jessica thought. This hand belonged to someone who needed to remain precise, perhaps someone with something to hide. She turned the paper over, blank. Whoever had left it had done so quietly, with access to her room and the confidence to move unnoticed. It was a message from someone close, perhaps uncomfortably close, and someone who didn't want the recital or her presence to unfold unchallenged. Jessica descended to the front desk just after 8. The dining area smelled of warm muffins and sea air. A single guest read the newspaper by the window, oblivious to her inquiry. The innkeeper, a stout man with soft hands and thinning hair, looked up as she approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher. Sleep well?" she offered a smile. "Restfully enough, though I did wake to find something unusual." She unfolded the note and handed it to him. He read it, then glanced at her over the top of his glasses. "Strange," he murmured, and handed it back. "We haven't had any other guests on your floor last night. Just the young man in room 205, and he came in after midnight. No deliveries? No staff rounds? Not that I'm aware of." He paused, then added with a polite cough, "This town, well, it remembers things, not always fondly." Jessica studied him. He wasn't being evasive exactly, just careful, as though gossip had taught him that the safest story was silence. She thanked him and turned away, the note folded once more. Jessica walked slowly through the harbor streets, the mist lifting in ragged curtains. The boats moored along the docks rocked gently, their rigging clicking like knitting needles. Provincetown, for all its beauty, wore its history close to the skin. She could feel it in the weathered planks, the faded signs, the narrowed glances from windows not quite fully opened. She passed a closed cafe, a pottery shop, and a small gallery with its door slightly ajar. A chalkboard sign read, "Recital Rehearsals. Today at 2, visitors welcome." A single tulip drooped from a vase beside it, the note still pressed against her coat pocket, a presence she could feel with every step. Someone didn't want her here, or perhaps someone didn't want her knowing. Eleanor's evasiveness from the day before returned to her mind. The slight pause when Jessica had mentioned the letter, the refusal to confirm or deny. What frightened Eleanor more? That the past might be unearthed, or that it might finally speak. Jessica stopped at the edge of the theater square, watching as a young woman unlocked the front doors and stepped inside. It was time to look closer. Jessica lingered on the far side of the square, pretending to study the old plaques fixed to the community theater's outer wall. Through the haze, She caught a glimpse of movement, dancers gathering, stretching near the footlights. The faint strains of piano echoed from within, fractured by distance and wind. And then, a figure appeared in the arched entryway, a woman in a rehearsal coat, dark-haired and tall, with an angular grace that hinted at years of discipline. She scanned the street with a practiced glance, casual but not careless. Their eyes met briefly across the cobblestones. The woman's expression did not change, but her gaze lingered just a moment too long. Then she turned abruptly and disappeared inside, pulling the door closed behind her. Jessica frowned. There was no recognition in the woman's face, but there was something else, wariness perhaps, or memory. She stepped away from the theater, her mind already racing. In a world of dancers, every movement meant something, and that glance, fleeting as it was, had not been accidental. Back in her room, Jessica locked the door with more intention than usual, and laid the note on her writing desk beside her travel notebook. She sat, uncapped her pen, and let the thoughts begin to organize themselves. The handwriting, deliberate. The paper, expensive. The scent, identical to the letter from Cabot Cove. That connection couldn't be ignored. But who had the motive to send both? She made 2 short lists in the margin of her notebook. Those who feared Eleanor's return to public life, and those who feared Jessica's presence. Names began to form. Clara Vale, the sister Eleanor wouldn't discuss. The young woman in the rehearsal coat. The elusive figure in the group photo Jessica had seen in Eleanor's sunroom, and perhaps 1 or 2 more she hadn't met yet. She paused, tapping her pen gently against the desk. The message hadn't frightened her, but it had unsettled something in the rhythm of the town, something old, something personal. Jessica rose and drew the curtains. Outside, the mist had cleared, but in her mind the fog was only beginning to settle. Tomorrow she would return to the theater, but tonight she would not leave the door unlocked. Jessica followed the curve of the gravel path, where purple tufts of lavender brushed her ankles with each step. The air was thick with their scent, warm and sharp under the mid-morning sun. Eleanor's garden unfolded in quiet symmetry, trimmed hedges, faded trellises, and a square of open lawn now arranged with folding chairs. At the far edge, the remnants of a stage had been assembled, low to the ground, bordered with sheer white drapery that stirred gently in the breeze. A pianist played soft scales under a canvas awning, while a trio of dancers moved in unison. Their lines were elegant, but tension pulsed in their rhythms, too quick, too tight, as if grace had been replaced by obligation. Jessica paused beside the lavender beds, watching in silence. It struck her how much performance lived outside of the spotlight, in clenched jaws, sidelong glances, careful positioning. Even among the beautiful, something uneasy stirred. At the far end of the lawn, Eleanor sat in a wicker chair with her hands folded in her lap, expression unreadable. Jessica approached slowly, not wishing to interrupt, though she had the odd feeling that something in this garden had been interrupted long ago. After the music paused, Eleanor rose and beckoned Jessica forward with a quiet smile. The dancers gathered near the stage steps, toweling sweat from their necks and stretching in near silence. "Jessica," Eleanor said, "may I introduce my former students? This is Dominic Gray, Charlotte Reeve, and Ilse Lang." Dominic was tall, with a proud, angular face and arms that seemed permanently poised in third position. He nodded politely, though his eyes assessed Jessica with caution. Charlotte gave a shallow smile, her hands never still, adjusting her braid, straightening her waistband, smoothing nothing at all. "We've heard of you," she said, her voice clipped but respectful. Ilse said nothing at first. She was younger than the others, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that flickered between curiosity and something warrior. "She's not here to dance," she murmured to no one in particular. Jessica extended her hand nonetheless. "No, but I've always admired those who can." The three exchanged glances, not openly hostile, but layered. Jessica noted it. Something old had returned to the garden, and it wasn't just her. Whatever this recital was meant to be, it was reopening more than choreography. The sharp click of heels on gravel turned their attention toward the garden gate. Clara Vale entered with no introduction and no hesitation. Dressed in navy silk and a wide-brimmed hat, she looked as though she had arrived for a funeral, but not one she mourned. Eleanor rose but said nothing. Jessica noted the subtle stiffness in her shoulders, the way her mouth pressed into a quiet line. "Well," Clara said, removing her gloves with a deliberate slowness, "still rehearsing the old ghosts, are we?" Charlotte and Dominic shifted uncomfortably. Ilse, however, met Clara's gaze with what could only be described as relief or perhaps allegiance. Jessica stepped slightly to the side, watching the scene unfold with the same precision she once reserved for courtroom testimony. No one had expected Clara, and no one welcomed her. "I didn't realize you were invited," Eleanor said coolly. Clara gave a faint laugh. "You don't need an invitation to revisit what's already yours." The silence that followed was taut. The dance rehearsal had a new audience and a new critic. The rehearsal resumed, but the ease had vanished. The dancers moved with precision, but not trust. Jessica could sense it. Small corrections turned into challenges, and grace was edged with frustration. "That pirouette ends too sharp," Charlotte said to Dominic. "I'm dancing it as written," he replied, voice brittle. "Ask Ilse." Ilse crossed her arms. "I didn't write it." Eleanor did, but maybe she was thinking of someone who could turn cleanly. The pianist faltered on the keys. Eleanor stood slowly from her chair. "The piece is not a contest, it's a conversation." But the dancers weren't listening anymore. Jessica observed them closely, each of them choreographing their own narrative beneath the music. She had seen this before, in literature and in life. Resentment disguised as discipline, admiration curdling into rivalry. And Clara watched with something like satisfaction. She made no notes, asked no questions, but her gaze was keen, like someone measuring what had changed and what had not. Jessica folded her arms and turned her thoughts inward. A story was unfolding on this lawn, yes, but the script had been written years ago. As the rehearsal paused for water and breath, Jessica wandered toward a small table tucked beneath the arbor. Among sun-warmed pitchers and spare towels sat an object that caught her attention, a delicate wooden music box, lid ajar. It was old, the kind of craftsmanship one rarely saw anymore, with inlaid mother-of-pearl that shimmered faintly in the light. A slow, uncertain melody drifted from within, the mechanism turning in tired circles. Jessica leaned closer. The tune was familiar, though not recent. She had heard it once, perhaps long ago, a piece not often performed, a lullaby or a dance motif, slow and mournful. And then, quite suddenly, the music stopped. Not faded, stopped. A sharp click. Jessica lifted the lid slightly. Inside, the spindle held a single slip of paper, its edge curled as if recently disturbed. But before she could read it, a shadow fell across the table. Clara stood behind her. "Some things are better left shut," she said softly. Jessica closed the box with care, but her thoughts remained open. The rehearsal concluded without ceremony. There was no applause, no laughter, no easing of tension, just bodies gathering towels, nods exchanged with minimal warmth, and dancers walking off in different directions without waiting for one another. Jessica stood beside Eleanor as the final strains of piano faded into the air. "Not quite the reunion you hoped for?" she asked gently. Eleanor gave a thin smile. "They're not here for me, Jessica. They're here for what I represent." "And what is that?" "A past they can't outrun, and don't quite remember honestly." Jessica nodded, but her eyes lingered on the trio retreating across the lawn. Ilsa walked ahead of Dominic, who adjusted his posture the moment Charlotte passed him without speaking. Clara stood apart, arms crossed, observing everything with a cool detachment. "I'm not sure what they hope to uncover," Eleanor added, "but they've each buried something." Jessica said nothing. Her instincts had grown quiet, sharpened by experience. Whatever had happened in Eleanor's past hadn't stayed there, and whatever this recital was meant to heal had only just begun to unravel. As guests began to trickle away, Clara moved toward the garden gate without speaking to anyone. She paused only once, at the edge of the stone path, and turned back toward Eleanor. It was not a long look, nor was it filled with emotion, but it carried weight, the kind that bore history, unfinished sentences, and questions too old to ask again. Jessica caught the exchange. The pause between sisters, the moment when silence says more than words ever could. Eleanor did not wave or nod. She simply watched. Jessica observed the way Eleanor's hand tightened against the arm of her chair, just slightly, as though bracing for something that never came. "She always leaves before it's over," Eleanor said, her voice flat. Jessica waited a moment before replying. "And yet she always arrives before anything begins." Eleanor said nothing more, but Jessica knew, in the Vale family, as in the dance, timing was never accidental, and this story still had movements left to play. Jessica stirred from sleep at the sound of pounding, not thunder, but a desperate, rhythmic knocking. It echoed down the hallway, muffled only slightly by the thick morning rain tapping against the window pane. She rose swiftly, slipped on her robe and opened the door. Charlotte Reeves stood there, drenched and breathless, hair plastered to her temples, eyes wide with something far deeper than panic. "You need to come," she whispered. "Now." "It's Eleanor." Jessica didn't speak, didn't ask. She grabbed her coat from the chair and followed Charlotte down the stairs, across the inn's narrow lobby, and out into the grey morning mist. Rain soaked her sleeves as they hurried along the garden path toward the back of the Vale property. The sky had yet to fully brighten, and everything around them seemed suspended in some wet, trembling pause. Charlotte said nothing more. Her silence was no longer one of rehearsal politics or artistic jealousy. It was the kind that came after you had seen something you could never unsee. Jessica already felt the shift, not in the weather but in the air between this morning and all the mornings before. By the time they reached the low building at the edge of the property, the studio Jessica had glimpsed only from afar, Dominic was already there, standing just off the steps in a soaked sweater, hands trembling at his sides. "She wasn't at breakfast," he murmured, and the door was open. Jessica moved past them both and reached for the handle. The door stood slightly ajar, but not fully open, as though someone had entered with hesitancy or left in haste. She pushed gently, the hinges creaked in protest, revealing a narrow hallway that smelled of dust, floor polish, and something faintly metallic. Charlotte hesitated behind her. I didn't want to go in alone." Jessica stepped through first, her senses sharpened by instinct. A low light flickered in the far room, where the floorboards gave way to mirrored walls and a dancer's bar. The silence was unnerving, not empty, but charged. Jessica could feel it even before she reached the threshold. The weight of stillness, too thick for an ordinary morning. She glanced toward the corner, where a single bulb glowed softly over a figure on the floor. One foot bent beneath her, one arm extended outward. Eleanor Vale. Jessica's breath caught as she entered the room. Eleanor lay motionless on the polished wood floor, her pale shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if placed with intention. But the most arresting detail was the shattered mirror beside her. A long crack ran across the wall like a fault line, with fragments scattered beneath her body. She knelt carefully, her eyes scanning for signs of life, of breath. There were none. The silence pressed against her ears, the unnatural kind that follows too late, like the pause after music ends and no one claps. In the corner, something ticked and whirred softly. Jessica turned her head. A small music box, the one she had seen in the garden, now rested on a bench near the window. Its lid was open. The tune played faintly, but incomplete, stumbling over the same notes again and again like a dancer who had forgotten the next step. Jessica stood slowly, her gaze moving across the floor. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no open windows, no marks on Eleanor's hands or face. But the cracked mirror felt symbolic, almost staged, a broken reflection, deliberate or accidental. Jessica didn't know, not yet. Sergeant Don Ames arrived just past 8, his brown raincoat soaked at the shoulders and his boots heavy with garden soil. He was a broad man, middle-aged, with the thoughtful frown of someone who had seen more than he cared to admit. Jessica met him at the door. Inside. "It's Eleanor." He gave a single nod, pulling a notepad from his coat pocket before stepping over the threshold. Within moments, his expression changed, not with alarm, but with the settled weariness of a man who understood what this meant to the town. He moved deliberately, asking Charlotte and Dominic to wait outside. Jessica remained. She had no official capacity, but Ames had worked with her once before, a missing heirloom, a falsified will, and he trusted her eyes. "You found her?" he asked. "She was here when we arrived," Jessica said, her voice low. "No sign of forced entry, no visible wounds." Ames nodded slowly, crouching beside the body. "Then something's been wounded elsewhere." Jessica didn't answer, but in her mind she noted the mirrors, broken outward, not inward. Something had fractured from within. Sergeant Ames moved methodically through the room, opening drawers, checking the window latches, examining the doorframe with quiet precision. Jessica followed at a respectful distance, noting the subtle things he paused to observe. The rug corner folded back near the bench, the teacup resting beside the music box, cold and untouched. "There's no sign," she struggled, he muttered. "No bruising, no broken skin, nothing knocked over." Jessica nodded, and the door was only slightly ajar. Someone left, but not in a hurry. Ames turned toward the studio entrance. "No one's reported hearing anything unusual." Jessica glanced at the window. It rained through the night. The sound may have covered whatever happened. Ames rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing on the mirror's broken edge. She hit it? Possibly. Or it was broken before. The music box played again, its melody slow and unsteady. Jessica walked to it and gently closed the lid. It stopped with a soft click. Ames looked up. "You think this was personal?" Jessica met his eyes. "Everything about this space is personal. The music, the mirrors, the placement of her shawl. Nothing about this feels random." The sergeant didn't disagree, nor did he look surprised. The sound came softly at first, a gasp, then the crack of a heel against the threshold. Clara stood in the doorway, her navy coat unbuttoned, a hand raised to her mouth. For a moment she simply stared, eyes fixed on her sister's body with a stillness that looked more like calculation than grief. And then, unexpectedly, she exhaled a sob. It was low, almost controlled, as though she had rehearsed it, not for deception, but survival. She stepped forward once, then faltered, her knees nearly giving way. Jessica reached out instinctively, steadying her by the elbow. "I didn't," Clara's voice cracked. "I thought she was resting. I didn't know she'd be." She stopped herself. Ames approached gently. "Clara, I'll need to ask you a few questions." Clara nodded, brushing at her cheek, though no tear had fallen. Jessica observed closely. The tremble in Clara's fingers, the deliberate way she avoided looking at the mirror, the slight shift in her breathing when the music box clicked shut. Grief was rarely simple, and guilt could look almost identical. While Sergeant Ames stepped outside to speak with Clara, Jessica remained in the studio, her gaze moving slowly across the room with renewed precision. The energy had shifted, the kind that lingered after secrets stirred too close to the surface. Near the bench where the music box sat, something caught her attention. Tucked behind the leg of a chair, barely visible beneath the edge of the rug, lay a single glove, cream-colored, delicate, expensive. She bent to retrieve it carefully. The material was soft kid leather, the kind worn not for warmth, but for elegance. A faint smudge of charcoal lined the fingertips, not ink, not dust, something theatrical. She glanced around. The glove hadn't been there yesterday during the rehearsal, she was certain of it. Jessica placed it gently atop the bench, beside the cold teacup. One item forgotten, another left unfinished. Her mind clicked quietly through possibilities. A visitor who hadn't stayed, a gesture not completed, or a memory that had returned and left something behind. Small things, Jessica knew, often told the largest truths, if one knew how to listen. As the last officers filtered in and the initial photographs were taken, Jessica stepped once more toward the music box. Someone had lifted the lid again, a young patrolman perhaps, or Clara herself. The melody resumed, wavering on the same unresolved phrase. Jessica stood over it, listening. The tune was a waltz, soft and melancholy, one she now remembered from a recital long ago, a solo piece Eleanor had choreographed herself, for an unnamed dancer who never performed it. And then, mid-phrase, the mechanism stuttered. The spindle gave a weak click, the box stopped. No final note, no resolution. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. Jessica turned back toward the doorway, where Clara stood once more, watching not the body, but the mirror. The cracked surface caught both women's reflections in jagged fragments. Jessica lowered the lid slowly. It was not the end of the song, merely the place where it had chosen, or been forced, to pause. Jessica had always believed that the most reliable witness to the past was not a person but a library. That afternoon, beneath the salt-stained awning of the Provincetown Historical Society and Library, she stepped into a room that smelled of paper and time. The woman at the front desk recognized her name and nodded with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "You're here about Eleanor Vale," she said, not unkindly. "Thought someone might be." Jessica smiled. "I'm hoping to look at old festival programs, press clippings, anything about the ballet company from the late 70s. The librarian gestured to a small reading alcove near the back. "We've got an archive. You'll want Mr. Faulkner. He handles special collections." The alcove was quiet, lit by a single window that filtered sunlight through dusty panes. Jessica sat at a broad oak table, pen poised above her notebook, while the past, patient and layered, waited to be uncovered. Outside, the wind swept down the harbor road. But inside, only paper rustled, and the faint, familiar tug of a story that was not yet finished, but had already left its imprint. Mr. Faulkner was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, with a librarian's reverence for both silence and detail. He returned from the back room carrying a cardboard box marked in faded blue ink, Provincetown Ballet Archive, Private Collection. She requested it not be public, he said quietly, as he set the box on the table. Miss Vale. But she never asked for it back either. No one else has touched it in years. Jessica nodded her thanks, her fingers resting gently on the lid before lifting it. Inside she found carefully stacked envelopes, brittle newspaper clippings, and a stack of yellowing programs tied with a pale blue ribbon. The scent of dust and lavender clung to the contents, faint but distinct. There was something reverent in the way the box had been packed, not merely stored but preserved. A curatorial tenderness that suggested someone once had meant to return to it. Jessica loosened the ribbon with care. Whatever Eleanor had chosen to bury, it had not been abandoned, only deferred. Near the middle of the box, Jessica found what she hadn't even realized she was looking for, a thin, delicate recital program, printed on cream cardstock, its edges curled inward from age. The Provincetown Winter Ballet Series, December 14, 1978. Beneath the elegant script were listed 4 performances, the final one solo for the Moon, choreographed and performed by Eleanor Vale. Jessica turned the page. There was no mention of a second dancer, though a footnote noted, originally staged as a pas de deux. She ran her fingers along the notation, wondering what had changed. Why had a duet become a solo? And why had this, her last performance, vanished so cleanly from public memory? There were no reviews tucked in the box, no commentary, only the program and a brief handwritten note in the margin, smudged and nearly illegible, too raw. Postponed. Jessica studied the script. It wasn't Eleanor's, it was unfamiliar, tight, upright, oddly formal. Something had happened that night, not in the spotlight, but behind the curtain, and it hadn't been meant for audiences. Beneath the last layer of paper and clippings, Jessica's fingers brushed against a soft, pliable parcel. She lifted it carefully, a thin record sleeve wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed with yellowed tape. There were no markings, save for 3 initials scrawled in black fountain ink, E.V. Jessica. Undid the tape gently. Inside was a 12-inch vinyl, matte black, with no printed label, only a faint white sticker bearing a handwritten date, December 14, 78. She felt her pulse quicken. This was not a commercial recording. This was private, intimate, the kind of keepsake created not for listeners, but for memory. Holding it in both hands, she noted the faint scent of hyacinth still clinging to the sleeve. She replaced the lid on the box, thanked Mr. Faulkner, and stepped into the sharp afternoon breeze with the record tucked carefully beneath her coat. There were voices that lived only in music, and sometimes secrets preserved themselves in melodies long after the dancers had left the stage. This record, she sensed, had not been played in decades, but tonight it would sing again. Back at the inn, Jessica asked the owner, a soft-spoken widow named Mrs. Keeley, whether there might be a working turntable on the premises. As it happened, her late husband's record player still stood in the music room, seldom used but lovingly dusted. Jessica thanked her and carried the vinyl to the small room, panelled in walnut and scented faintly with pipe tobacco and lemon polish. She placed the record carefully on the turntable and lowered the needle. There was a hiss, soft and ancient, then silence, followed by the gentle crackle of life returning. Piano, slow, measured. The opening bars of a waltz. Jessica closed her eyes, allowing the music to unfold. The melody was haunting, mournful, and breathtaking in its restraint, as though it had been written not to dazzle but to confess. Midway through the second movement, she heard it, the faintest intake of breath, not the pianist's. A dancer, perhaps. And something else, an echo of movement, or a whisper too soft to grasp. The room held its breath. Jessica leaned closer. The story wasn't over. Someone, had stayed on the record. The melody built toward a crescendo, but then faltered. A momentary hitch, the needle skipped, caught, and circled back by a bar. Jessica leaned in, adjusting the volume slightly. The record jumped again, hesitated, then stuttered forward, and then clear beneath the piano's ghostly refrain, a voice, not sung, spoken, soft, almost whispered. A name, Madeline. It was fragile, almost broken, but unmistakable. Jessica sat still, pen forgotten in her lap, heart slowly stirring beneath the calm. The name had not appeared in any program, nor had Eleanor mentioned it aloud, but the way it was spoken, careful, reverent, desperate, suggested it had once meant everything. The music played on, unaware that the past had just stirred. Jessica let the final notes fade, before lifting the needle. She sat in silence, watching the record spin down. Who had spoken the name, and who was Madeline? Not a dancer on the program, not among the current students, but someone Eleanor had choreographed for, or perhaps with. Someone meant to stay in the duet, and someone whose absence had remained unspoken, until now. Jessica remained seated, the room growing darker around her as the last of the afternoon light slipped behind the hills. The name hung in her thoughts like a lingering note, incomplete, unresolved. Madeline. She closed her eyes briefly, and allowed the garden rehearsal to rise in memory. The moments of hesitation between Dominic and Ilse, the way Eleanor had watched from her chair, motionless except when the music played, and most vividly, the photo on the mantel, the one with the girl in the background, standing apart from the others. She hadn't looked at the camera, she'd looked at Eleanor. Jessica opened her notebook and drew a quick sketch. 4 dancers, one in shadow, no label, just posture. She had seen the photograph only once, but its quiet power had stayed with her. What if that young woman, the one who had seemed almost erased, hadn't left by choice? What if she had been removed? Jessica closed the notebook slowly. The story of Eleanor's final recital was not about a performance, it was about a disappearance, and a voice, at last, remembering. Jessica returned to the Vale property late the next morning, drawn not by duty, but by instinct. The dancers were rehearsing again, this time in solemn near silence. The energy had changed since Eleanor's death, slower, more careful, like a ritual continued out of reverence, rather than passion. She lingered at the edge of the garden, just beyond the trimmed hedges that lined the gravel walk. As the music began, she glanced toward the far end of the lawn, and saw her. A woman, perhaps in her late 50s, stood half hidden beside the studio steps. She wore a long slate blue coat, her dark hair streaked with silver, drawn back with the simplicity of someone who no longer expected to be noticed. Yet Jessica noticed her, not just because of the stillness in her stance, but because of the intensity in her eyes, fixed not on the dancers, but on the space Eleanor used to occupy. It was the face from the photograph. Older now, but not unfamiliar. Jessica's breath caught gently in her throat. Whoever this woman was, she hadn't come to observe. She had come to remember, and perhaps to be remembered. Jessica approached slowly, her shoes crunching lightly over the gravel path. The woman turned before Jessica spoke, as if expecting her. "You knew her," Jessica said softly. It wasn't a question. The woman nodded once, eyes unreadable. "Eleanor and I, we were close. Once. May I ask your name?" A moment's pause, then, "Madeline. Madeline Burke." Jessica held her gaze. You danced with her. I did, until I didn't. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a tired sort of acceptance, like someone who had learned to live without rewriting the past. I heard the music, Madeline added. I thought maybe it was time. Jessica studied her, remembering the whispered name on the record, the solitary figure in the photo, the absence that had never been publicly explained. I'd like to talk with you, Madeline, if you're willing. Madeline hesitated, then nodded. Not here, Jessica gestured gently. There's a small tea shop just down the street. It's quiet. For the first time Madeline smiled, faint and cautious. Quiet sounds good. The tea shop was nearly empty. Jessica chose a table near the window, where the sound of the waves rolled faintly through the glass. The tea arrived in mismatched china, Earl Grey for Jessica, chamomile for Madeline. For a few moments, they drank in silence. Jessica waited. The older she got, the more she trusted quiet to coax the truth. It wasn't dramatic, Madeline said at last. No confrontation, no letters, just a walk away. Jessica stirred her tea gently. But you didn't walk far enough to forget. Madeline's eyes lingered on her cup. There are things you don't forget, and people you don't stop waiting for, even after you've stopped expecting them. Jessica said nothing. The air between them was filled not with tension, but with the fragility of long-contained emotion. She told me once, Madeline said, her voice softening, that dancing was how she mourned. Every step, a goodbye. Jessica looked at her carefully. And did you mourn something, or someone? Madeline raised her eyes. Both. Outside the fog was beginning to clear, but inside the tea room, the past was only beginning to settle. She wasn't cruel, Madeline said quietly, just afraid of what it would cost her. Jessica listened, letting the pieces arrange themselves gently in her mind. I was a student. She was my teacher. It wasn't something we planned. It just became. And someone found out, Jessica said softly. Madeline nodded. Not publicly, but someone in the company, someone who made it clear it had to stop. Jessica folded her hands. And Eleanor? Madeline's smile was wistful, almost fond. She never said a word against them, not in front of anyone. But after that, I wasn't cast again, not even for group work. Jessica tilted her head slightly. She protected you by removing you. She thought it would save me. Jessica's breath caught at the sadness behind the words, the kind that doesn't fade with age, only changes its tone. It wasn't just about us, Madeline added. There was another dancer, someone who'd always felt they were supposed to be in Eleanor's light. Jessica thought of Clara, of the music box, of the fragmented mirror, rivalry and silence, art and sacrifice. Madeline finished her tea. And once I was gone, they erased me. Quietly, beautifully. Jessica leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. Can you tell me about the last night you saw her? Madeline nodded slowly. It was after a rehearsal. Winter had set in. The studio was cold, and the mirrors fogged. She was rehearsing alone that last piece. I was watching from the side. She paused, eyes far away. Clara came in. I don't know what was said, but I heard my name. And then Eleanor's voice, low, firm, not angry, just final. What did you do? I stepped back, Madeline whispered. I left through the side door. I don't think Eleanor even saw me go. Did you speak again? Madeline shook her head. No letters, no phone calls. She made the choice for both of us, and I let her. Jessica absorbed this quietly. The silence that followed didn't need filling. It was the same silence that had filled the studio all those years ago. Sometimes the cruelest things are done in kindness, And sometimes love is the one thing that disappears without being reported missing. As they stepped outside, the sun breaking faintly through the clouds, Jessica felt the shift, the story no longer theoretical, but human, real, tragic in its restraint. "Does anyone else know you're back?" she asked. Madeline hesitated. "I think Dominic saw me. Maybe Ilsa, but no one's spoken." Jessica nodded, her thoughts stirring. "There are people who might not welcome your return." Madeline smiled faintly. "There always were." Jessica thought of Clara's stare across the garden, the whispered name caught on the record, the glove left behind in the studio. Clara had lived in Eleanor's shadow, but shadows deepen when light is divided. "Do you believe Eleanor knew you were here?" Jessica asked. "I don't know," Madeline said softly. "But if she did, she didn't stop me." Jessica looked down the road, where rehearsal would begin again soon. Not all ghosts are silent. Some return in quiet shoes and familiar perfumes. And some secrets don't stay buried, not when memory walks among the living. Later that evening, Jessica walked Madeline back to the small guest house at the edge of town, where she'd quietly taken a room. They paused at the door, the porch light flickering above them. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Madeline said, voice low. "I know," Jessica replied, "but trouble doesn't always require intention." They exchanged a quiet goodbye, and Jessica turned to go. As she walked the dim hallway of the inn that night, her steps slow and measured, she paused, a creak, barely audible. Jessica turned her head, just enough. A figure moved beyond the landing above her. The hall was too dark to see clearly, but she caught the faint silhouette of someone watching. Still, quiet, not threatening, but present. Jessica didn't call out. Instead, she continued toward her room, footsteps even, mind alert. There were eyes in the corridors now, watching not only her, but Madeline, and whoever had whispered that name on the record had not expected to see the subject walking the streets of Provincetown again. Not alive, and certainly not willing to speak. Jessica sat in the bay window of her room, a soft wind pressing against the panes. The afternoon light filtered across her notebook, where she had drawn a line between 3 words: Madeline, glove, music box. She tapped the pencil against the margin. There had been no sign of struggle in the studio, but the cracked mirror had not cracked itself. The glove, left behind, too fine, too intentional to have fallen by chance. And then the voice on the record speaking Madeline's name in that fragile, reverent whisper. It was not just a name spoken in memory, it was a name spoken in conflict. Jessica turned a page and wrote the next thread. Clara. She thought back to the glance exchanged between the sisters after rehearsal, stiff, layered with something that had not been resolved in years. Clara had arrived uninvited. Clara had dismissed the music box with cold precision. And then there was the final piece, the unfinished score found near Eleanor's chair, handwritten, torn at the edge. Jessica closed the notebook, exhaling slowly. Truth never came in a single moment. It came in echoes, fragments, glances, and she was beginning to hear the full phrase. The little repair shop on Main Street was easy to miss, tucked between a florist and a consignment bookstore. Its sign, harbor timepieces and musical keepsakes, hung slightly crooked above the door. Inside, the scent of wood oil and old felt filled the air. Clocks ticked gently from every wall, but Jessica had eyes only for the man behind the counter. Tall, bald, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved as if every motion still held sound. "I was hoping you could tell me something about a music box," she said, setting down a sketch she'd made of Eleanor's. He nodded. Brought in about a month ago. Beautiful mechanism. I remember it. Do you remember who brought it? He hesitated. Woman. Late 60s perhaps. Neat. Controlled. Told me to be careful with it. Said she wanted it to play again. But not too clearly. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Not too clearly. She said she didn't want it sounding perfect. Just enough to remember. He leaned forward, voice lowering. Some folks bring things in for comfort. Others to provoke it. She wasn't grieving, Mrs. Fletcher. She was rehearsing something. Jessica thanked him, and stepped out, heart slightly heavier. Clara Vale's cottage was just beyond the bluff, where the sea wind slapped against the hedges with indifferent rhythm. Jessica walked the gravel path alone, her bag slung lightly over her shoulder, her mind settled. Clara answered on the second knock, dressed in grey slacks and a silk blouse, her hair pinned tightly back. I suppose this was inevitable, she said. Not bitter, resigned. May I come in? Clara stepped aside, and Jessica entered a living room of perfect order, books aligned by height, photographs in heavy frames, not one thing out of place. I'm not here to accuse you, Clara, Jessica said, only to understand. Clara poured tea with meticulous grace, then sat across from her. You're not the first to come seeking the truth behind Eleanor's mystique. She wasn't mysterious, Jessica said gently. She was guarded. Clara looked away. That studio, that stage was her church. She made it holy, and she made sure there was no room for any heretics. Or partners, Jessica asked. Clara's eyes met hers then, dark and unreadable, especially not partners. And in the silence that followed, Jessica finally heard the faint creak of a heart long shuttered. Later that day, Jessica returned to the studio, now empty but for dust and memory. The scent of lavender had faded, replaced by the faint sting of metal and varnish. She moved slowly, observing. Her eyes returned again and again to the cracked mirror, its jagged fault line splitting a reflection that no longer held form. She approached, fingertips brushing the edge of the radiator beneath the window, and there, tucked just behind it, was a single dance shoe, small, scuffed, out of place. Jessica knelt to retrieve it, holding it in her hands like something sacred. It had been worn, not for performance, but practice, the ribbon frayed, the leather worn smooth at the arch. It did not belong to Madeline, the size was wrong, but it matched the shoes Clara had worn during the rehearsal the week before, shoes she claimed not to have kept. Jessica stood, the shoe still in her hand, her thoughts racing. The mirror had broken from within. Not a fall, not an accident. A moment of fury, a betrayal, a partner rehearsing alone, for a dance no one else was meant to finish. Jessica returned to Clara's home just after dusk. She held the shoe in one hand, the silence in the other. Clara opened the door without surprise. She stepped aside without invitation. Jessica set the shoe on the polished coffee table. You said you never danced again. Clara stared at it, unmoving. I didn't, not publicly. Jessica sat. But here in Provincetown, you kept practicing. Clara's voice was barely audible in the early mornings. When no one watched, you were supposed to dance the pas de deux with Eleanor, weren't you? Clara laughed, not unkindly, just bitter. It was never really a duet, Jessica. Not when she needed to be the whole stage. Jessica didn't speak. She let the silence unfold. I wasn't angry she loved Madeline, Clara said finally. I was angry she never considered that I had loved her too, differently, quietly, but with just as much cost. Jessica's heart ached in that measured way truth often brought. "You weren't forgotten," she said. Clara looked up. "No, I was erased." Outside the wind rose. Inside something finally settled, but not yet forgiven, not yet confessed. Clara stood walking slowly toward the window, one hand against the sill. "That last night," she said quietly. "I found her in the studio. She'd lit candles. Eleanor never used overhead lights when she danced alone. It was like watching a cathedral breathe." Jessica remained seated, listening. She was rehearsing the old piece, Solo for the Moon, the one meant for two, but she moved through it like she didn't remember anyone else had ever been part of it. "What did you say?" Jessica asked. "I told her the music box had been repaired, that I wanted her to hear it, not the way it was, but the way it had always sounded to me, a little broken." Clara turned slowly. "She didn't thank me. She didn't even stop dancing. She said, 'It was never for you, Clara.'" Her voice cracked. "I picked up the box and threw it at the mirror. It shattered." She spun toward me, shocked, and then she stumbled, fell. Her head struck the bar. Jessica's chest tightened. "I didn't mean," Clara's voice broke. "I thought she'd rise again. She always did. She always did." She lowered her face to her hands. Jessica said nothing, because this wasn't confession. It was mourning. The next morning was cold and bright, the kind of day that felt almost inappropriate for tragedy. Jessica stood outside Clara's house as Sergeant Don Ames stepped up the walk, his expression somber but unhurried. He tipped his hat to Jessica, then paused at the door. "She told you everything?" he asked. Jessica nodded. "Yes, and none of it with pride." He looked down at the notebook in his hand. "No charges for premeditation, but there will be questions." "She'll answer them," Jessica said gently. "She's tired of silence." A moment later, Clara stepped out. Her coat was buttoned, gloves in hand. She held a small bundle, sheet music, Jessica saw, folded around a leather-bound journal. Ames didn't cuff her. He simply nodded, and she followed him without protest. Jessica watched them walk to the car. No drama, no final words. But as Clara reached the steps, she paused, looking once more at the town below, at the sea beyond it, at the studio, the memory of music. And then she turned, not toward Jessica but toward something only she could see, and went quietly into the truth she had spent a lifetime dancing around. The late afternoon light stretched low across the floor of the Provincetown Theatre, casting long amber shadows between rows of velvet seats. Jessica entered quietly, her footsteps muffled by the old carpet, the hush in the room already thick with anticipation. She took her place midway down the left aisle, a few seats back from the stage. But her eyes were drawn immediately to the front row, center, first seat, a place reserved not by name but by sentiment. Draped over the back was a single rose, ivory and fresh, with a ribbon that bore no writing, only a deep burgundy hue that matched the stage curtains. It was Eleanor's seat. Jessica studied it for a moment, sensing that everyone who entered the room glanced at it, then looked away. Some paused, some bowed their heads. No one dared sit near it. The orchestra pit remained unfilled. This performance would not be accompanied by instruments or announcements, only memory. Jessica's notebook was tucked in her bag, unopened. Tonight was not for deductions, it was for something else, for grief perhaps, for grace, or simply for a woman who, even in absence, had choreographed one final, unspoken gesture. There was no announcement, no conductor's baton, just a collective quiet, and then movement. The stage lights lifted slowly, as if uncertain whether to rise at all. A single dancer emerged from stage left, arms poised in that familiar curve, footsteps bare against the worn wood. Then another joined. And another. They moved not in unison, but in shared rhythm, a weaving of bodies that spoke of seasons passing, of beginnings unfurling and folding into memory. Jessica watched, breath slow, eyes gently narrowed. These were not performances for acclaim. The dancers looked not outward, but inward. Each gesture, each pirouette, felt like an echo of something remembered rather than rehearsed. The choreography bore Eleanor's imprint, precise, expressive, restrained, but there were newer flourishes too, a lifted hand that hesitated, a turned face that did not seek the spotlight, but simply stood in it for a breath longer than expected. Behind the curtain, Eleanor's absence formed the backdrop. Jessica sensed the dancers knew this. They moved as though tethered to someone invisible, a presence that shaped every line of motion without ever taking the stage. The dance was not for the audience, it was for the one who could no longer teach. In the second half of the recital, a lone figure stepped into the pale blue wash of center stage. The program listed her name as Lila Monroe, young, elegant, and unmistakably trained in the veil technique. Her spine held that same upright dignity Eleanor once possessed, her movements deliberate yet vulnerable. The music began, faint strings, distant wind, and Lila moved with careful stillness, as if remembering with her whole body. It was Eleanor's original solo. Jessica recognized the phrasing, the slow fall of the right arm, the weighted turn to stage right, but something was different. Here and there, a gesture emerged, a mirrored pause, a breath held longer than the measure required, at first subtle, then deliberate. Jessica leaned forward. These were Clara's motions. Jessica had seen them before, in the rehearsal, in the garden, simple shifts, expressive, but rarely taught. Leela wasn't imitating them. She was including them. The solo had become a duet in spirit, a quiet, final reconciliation, choreographed, not in words, but in motion. Jessica felt a chill rise, not of cold, but of something nearly holy. Forgiveness had entered the room, not spoken, not even granted, but danced. Jessica's gaze drifted from the stage to those around her. The audience sat hushed, not merely respectful but suspended, caught between past and present in a collective stillness. To her left, the town's librarian held a handkerchief in her lap, crumpled tight but unused. Beside her, a former student of Eleanor's, Michael Vance, if Jessica recalled correctly, sat with his hands clasped, knuckles pale, eyes rimmed in red. Further back, behind the row of modest donors, sat Madeline Burke, dressed plainly. Her expression unreadable, she leaned slightly forward, as if afraid to breathe too deeply. Jessica watched her closely. Madeline's fingers moved unconsciously along the hem of her coat, tracing an invisible rhythm. Every person in that theater bore something: regret, reverence, relief. Even Sergeant Ames had taken a seat in the shadows, his cap in his lap, his face set not with law, but with quiet respect. This was not just a performance, it was a reckoning, and in that reckoning, Jessica felt how Eleanor had shaped not only movement, but memory, how every step choreographed on stage was mirrored by the unspoken shifts inside the hearts who had come to witness it. For the final movement, the stage fell into darkness once more. A single spotlight lit the far corner, where a lone stool sat beside a gramophone. From its mouth, the familiar melody began. The same haunting refrain Jessica had heard in her room, but this time there was no skip, no voice buried beneath the notes. The recording had been repaired, not restored to perfection, but allowed to complete itself. The music box's tune wound softly through the air, brittle at first, then blooming into fragile beauty. On stage, A small ensemble moved slowly, their choreography understated. One dancer reached toward the air, her hand trembling as if touching someone not there. Another followed, their paths never intersecting, yet connected. Jessica felt the melody wrap around the theater like a memory reclaimed. This was the version Eleanor never finished, the one Clara had held in her hands, the one no one had dared to complete, and yet, here it was, soft, sincere, finished not by force, but by the gentlest act of remembrance. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, letting the final bars settle into her like dust on sunlight. It was not a finale, it was a return. When the final dancer exited, the stage remained empty, the lights did not go out. They softened, just enough to leave the impression of presence without occupation. No one clapped. Jessica glanced around, half expecting someone to start, but no hands moved. Instead, one by one, the audience rose. Silently, they stood not in ovation, but in stillness. A shared breath of acknowledgement. Jessica rose too, folding her hands at her waist. The silence deepened, a silence so profound, it almost had weight. It was not emptiness, it was reverence. In that quiet, she thought of Eleanor not as the woman from the newspaper articles, nor the figure behind the music box, nor even the grieving sister she had tried so long to outdistance, but simply as the dancer who had never stopped choreographing, even in grief. Around her, people began to leave, not hurried, not whispering, just quietly, as if each had taken something invisible from the room and folded it inside their chest. Jessica lingered a moment longer. Some endings did not call for applause. Some were best honored in the silence between final notes. Backstage, the lighting was softer, dimmer, leftover warmth from the glow of the performance. Jessica moved carefully between folded curtains and prop trunks, nodding to performers as they passed. She found Madeline near the back, alone, still holding the same scarf she'd worn earlier, now loosely coiled in her hands. It was Eleanor's. She would have hated the lighting, Madeline said with a half smile. But I think she would have approved of the quiet. Jessica smiled in return. She would have noticed every angle and every silence. They stood in companionable stillness. Then Madeline glanced down at the scarf. I kept this, not to hold on to her, but because it smelled like lavender, like rehearsal mornings and long sighs. Jessica nodded. Scent is the last memory to leave us, and often the truest. Madeline's fingers tightened slightly. I'm not sure what happens now. Neither was Eleanor, Jessica said gently, but she still danced. Madeline looked up, and for the first time her expression was not shadowed. Thank you, she said. Jessica touched her arm, then turned toward the hallway. Outside, the night waited. But something had already been laid to rest. The morning air carried the scent of salt and lavender as Jessica stepped out of the inn, suitcase in hand. The sky stretched pale above the harbor, boats rocking gently, their masts swaying like slow metronomes. The train station was just a short walk away, and Jessica took it at an easy pace. Provincetown had changed shape in her mind, less a place, more a memory set to music. As the town slipped behind her, she thought of Eleanor's legacy, not the scandals, nor the headlines, but the spaces between choreography, the discipline, the silences, the room she left for others to fill. She thought of Clara too, walking away not from guilt, but toward truth, slowly, as one might exit a stage, uncertain of the applause. And of Madeline, standing beneath the stage lights, not forgotten, not hidden, just returned. Jessica boarded her train, settled into her seat, and gazed out at the shifting coastline. Some mysteries resolved themselves not with answers, but with grace, and some steps, even danced alone, still left footprints others could follow. She opened her notebook, paused, then closed it again. Some stories didn't need rewriting, they only needed to be seen. Some stories end not with a gavel or a headline, but with a single rose left behind, and a melody finally brought to rest. But what do we make of guilt that hides inside love, or the kind of silence that doesn't protect, but quietly destroys? What do you think truly happened between Eleanor and Clara in the mirror room that final night? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to know. And if this mystery stirred something in you, feel free to like the video, pass it along to a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more stories where truth waits quietly, just beneath the surface.